Chuck Connors wasn't just a TV cowboy. He was a real-life rebel, an athlete, actor, and political enigma who broke every rule Hollywood quietly demanded its stars follow. While most actors played it safe to protect their careers, Connors did the opposite. He spoke his mind, lived on his own terms, and walked straight into controversy without blinking. And in the end, it cost him everything. He had the face of a hero, the build of a ball player, and the voice of a legend. Millions knew him as Lucas McCain from The Rifleman, a sharpshooting single father in the Wild West who brought heart and justice to TV like no one else. But behind the scenes, Connors' life was anything but straightforward. He wasn't a family man. He played on screen. He was intense, complicated, and impossible to box in. This was a man who once played for both the NBA and Major League Baseball, then walked away from sports at the height of his game. Something almost unheard of at the time. Why? Because he saw something bigger coming. Acting, television, fame. But even after he found it, he didn't conform. He refused to be just another Hollywood puppet. Chuck Connors broke all the rules, on screen and off. He aligned himself with powerful political figures when it was unpopular to do so. He befriended the leader of the Soviet Union in the middle of the Cold War. He married across racial lines during one of the most racially charged eras in American media. And through it all, he stayed unapologetically true to himself. But the world wasn't ready for that kind of independence. By the time the Western genre faded and Hollywood started changing, Connors found himself on the outside looking in. The roles dried up. The studios stopped calling. And the same industry that once made him a household name slowly erased him from the spotlight. What happened to Chuck Connors wasn't a scandal. It was worse. It was silence. So, how did one of TV's most iconic stars go from a national treasure to a forgotten figure? Why did Hollywood turn its back on a man who built his career on strength, integrity, and guts? And what truths about his personal life, career collapse, and secret friendships are still being uncovered today? This is the story they don't tell you about Chuck Connors, the athlete who walked away from a game, the actor who defied the system, the man who made enemies by staying loyal to his beliefs, and the legacy he left behind when everything else was taken from him. Because Chuck Connors didn't just live in the spotlight. He challenged everything it stood for. And when you break all the rules, you better be ready to pay the price. Before Chuck Connors became a household name through his acting career, he was already making headlines in the world of sports. Standing at an imposing 6 feet 5 inches, Connors possessed a rare combination of size, strength, and agility that allowed him to excel in both professional basketball and baseball, a feat achieved by only a select few athletes. In the mid-1940s, Connors began his professional sports journey with the Boston Celtics during the inaugural season of the Basketball Association of America, BAA, which would later merge to form the NBA. His tenure with the Celtics was marked by a historic moment. During a pregame warm-up in 1946, Connors took a set shot that shattered the backboard, the first recorded incident of its kind in professional basketball. This unexpected event caused a significant delay in the game and added a unique chapter to the sport's history. Parallel to his basketball career, Connors pursued professional baseball with equal fervor. He played as a first baseman for the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1949 and later for the Chicago Cubs in 1951. While his Major League Baseball statistics were modest, his dedication to the sport was evident through his extensive minor league career, which included stints with teams like the Montreal Royals and the Los Angeles Angels of the Pacific Coast League. Connors' athletic versatility was not just a testament to his physical abilities, but also to his relentless work ethic and determination. Balancing two demanding sports careers required an extraordinary level of commitment, and Connors rose to the challenge with unwavering focus. His experiences on the basketball court and baseball diamond laid a solid foundation for his subsequent acting career. The discipline, resilience, and charisma he developed as an athlete seamlessly translated to his performances on screen. Moreover, his sports background provided him with a unique perspective and authenticity that resonated with audiences, particularly in roles that demanded physical prowess and a commanding presence. In retrospect, Chuck Connors' dual-sport career is a remarkable narrative of ambition and adaptability. His ability to navigate and succeed in two of America's most competitive sports arenas speaks volumes about his character and determination. This chapter of his life not only highlights his athletic achievements, but also sets the stage for his transition into the entertainment industry, where he would continue to break barriers and redefine success. When Chuck Connors left the world of professional sports, many assumed he was simply another athlete whose time in the limelight had passed. But Connors wasn't done yet. Not even close. What came next was a complete reinvention, one that would etch his name into American pop culture for decades. Leaving behind the cleats and basketballs, Connors turned his sights to Hollywood, and against the odds, he made it work. It started modestly. Connors took small acting gigs in the early 1950s, appearing in uncredited roles and slowly building his on-screen presence. He didn't have formal acting training, but what he did have was a natural charisma, a commanding stature, and a presence that filled the screen. Casting directors noticed. He had the kind of face that fit the rugged characters of westerns and war films. Tough, stoic, but capable of deep emotion. In 1952, Connors landed his first credited role in South Sea Woman alongside Burt Lancaster. From there, he picked up steam. His sports fame helped open doors, but it was his work ethic and authenticity that kept him in the room. He wasn't just playing a tough guy. He was one shaped by years of discipline on the field and court. His early roles included appearances in Old Yeller, The Hired Gun, and a handful of lesser-known westerns that allowed him to refine his craft. But the turning point, the role that would change his life, came in 1958, when Connors was cast as Lucas McCain in The Rifleman. The show centered around a widowed rancher raising his young son in the Wild West, using a modified Winchester rifle to protect his family and values. It was a fresh take on the Western genre, not just guns and shootouts, but moral questions, emotional depth, and real father-son dynamics. Connors brought all of it to life. What made Connors shine wasn't just his steely eyes or sharpshooter skills. It was a vulnerability he brought to Lucas McCain. He played the role with a balance of strength and sensitivity, portraying a man who had endured great loss, but still chose to raise his son with compassion and resolve. The show became an instant hit and ran for 5 seasons, earning both critical acclaim and a dedicated fan base. Behind the scenes, Connors wasn't just an actor. He was deeply involved in the creative direction of the show. He pushed for stories that tackled real issues, including racial injustice, PTSD, and the struggles of single parenthood. This added a layer of authenticity that kept the show ahead of its time and helped it stand apart in a saturated Western market. Connors' rise to fame wasn't just about good timing or luck. It was about reinvention. He took what seemed like the end of one career and used it as the launch pad for another. And in doing so, he not only proved his doubters wrong, but also helped redefine what a leading man could look like on American television. Chuck Connors wasn't just a television cowboy. He was a man of strong opinions, unwavering loyalties, and, surprisingly, political contradictions that still puzzle historians and fans alike. While his on-screen persona as Lucas McCain was defined by rugged independence and moral clarity, off-screen, Connors' political journey was a maze of unexpected twists that blurred party lines and national borders. In the United States, Connors was a vocal conservative. He wasn't shy about it either. He campaigned openly for Richard Nixon, supported Barry Goldwater, and later became an enthusiastic backer of Ronald Reagan. At a time when Hollywood leaned heavily liberal, Connors stood out unafraid to speak his mind. He attended Republican fundraisers, supported the Vietnam War effort, and was often seen shaking hands with GOP heavyweights. To many, he was the archetype of the all-American patriot, a stance that earned him admiration from some and ire from others. But then came the curveball, his unlikely friendship with Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev. Yes, you read that right. The same Chuck Connors who marched for Nixon and was a darling of the conservative elite somehow became close with the head of America's Cold War rival. The story goes that Brezhnev was a massive fan of The Rifleman, a detail that may sound like propaganda, but is actually well documented. When the Soviet leader visited the United States in 1973, he made a bizarre, personal request to meet Connors in person. President Richard Nixon, recognizing bizarre but politically useful opportunity, arranged for Connors to greet Brezhnev on the tarmac at Andrews Air Force Base. What followed was one of the most surreal handshakes of the Cold War. The conservative American actor meeting the communist leader, both grinning like old friends. Connors even presented Brezhnev with a pair of engraved Colt revolvers, gifts that symbolized not just diplomacy, but Connors' own brand of cowboy charm. The friendship didn't end there. Connors later visited Moscow and was treated with high honors. Some U.S. officials quietly raised eyebrows. Was it just fanfare, or did Brezhnev genuinely see Connors as a kindred spirit? Either way, the relationship didn't align with the black and white ideology of Cold War politics, and that's exactly what made it fascinating. For Connors, this wasn't about political betrayal or naivety. It was about personal connection. He believed that human relationships transcended politics, and he lived that belief boldly. While his critics labeled him inconsistent or opportunistic, Connors didn't care. He knew who he was, a man who followed his instincts, even when it didn't make sense to anyone else. His relationship with Brezhnev was a reminder that even in times of global tension, the lines between enemy and ally weren't always as clear-cut as they seemed. And in Chuck Connors' world, where rules were made to be broken, that kind of contradiction wasn't a problem. It was a legacy. Chuck Connors might have played America's most steadfast father figure on TV, but real life was messier, far more complicated than the black and white morality of the Rifleman. While his on-screen character embodied loyalty, strength, and family devotion, Connors' personal life painted a more tangled portrait, one of romantic missteps, public scrutiny, and rumors that never fully faded. Connors was married 3 times. His first and longest marriage was to Elizabeth Riddell, whom he met in Canada during his minor league baseball years. They married in 1948 and had 4 sons together. For a time, it seemed picture perfect. But as his acting career exploded, the pressures of fame, long shoots, and a growing gap in priorities strained the relationship. They divorced in 1961, and Connors never had another marriage that lasted. His second marriage to Indian actress Kamala Devi, whom he met on the set Branded, raised a few eyebrows. She was intelligent, elegant, and from a vastly different cultural background than the one Connors came from. Their marriage in 1963 made headlines, especially at a time when interracial relationships in Hollywood were still seen as controversial. Some viewed it as progressive, others as a publicity stunt. The reality? Connors and Devi shared genuine chemistry, but their union lasted only until 1972. A third brief marriage followed, but Connors never found a lasting romantic connection again. And then there were the rumors, the ones that never quite went away. Throughout his life, whispers followed Connors, questioning his sexuality. Some suggested that his 3 marriages were meant to deflect speculation, while others tied him to various well-known male figures in the entertainment industry. But here's the thing, there's no credible evidence to support those claims. What existed were persistent rumors, half-truths, and Hollywood gossip, a toxic mix that was often aimed at any actor who didn't conform entirely to the era's narrow definition of masculinity. What's more telling is how Connors handled it. He never addressed the rumors directly, and he didn't need to. He lived on his own terms, unbothered by speculation. His friendships, regardless of gender, were close, loyal, and intense. Those who knew him personally described him as both fiercely private and unapologetically honest. If he felt misunderstood, he rarely showed it publicly. Connors' relationship with his sons was complex. He adored them, but his relentless work schedule and personal demons often got in the way. Tragedy struck when one of his sons died in a motorcycle accident, a wound Connors carried quietly for the rest of his life. Those closest to him say it changed him. He grew more introspective, more reflective, even a little more distant from the Hollywood circles he once commanded. In many ways, Chuck Connors was a man out of time. Fiercely individualistic, morally certain, but trapped between the image the world demanded and the personal truths he guarded. His personal life wasn't perfect. It was flawed, layered, and human. But maybe that's what made him relatable. Not just as an actor, but as a man navigating fame, grief, and identity in a world quick to judge. At the height of his fame, Chuck Connors was unstoppable. The Rifleman had cemented him as a cultural icon, a man who brought grit and heart to primetime TV. But fame is fickle, and Hollywood doesn't always reward loyalty. After the show's end in 1963, Connors faced a harsh reality. The roles stopped coming, the offers dried up, and the same industry that once chased him now seemed eager to move on. It wasn't immediate. Connors transitioned into another series, Branded, in 1965. It was bold, emotionally complex, and featured a dishonored soldier trying to reclaim his reputation, a role that seemed tailor-made for him. While the show developed a strong fan base and critical acclaim, it was short-lived. 2 seasons, then gone. And this time, there was no next big thing waiting for him. Part of the reason? The Western genre itself was dying. By the late 1960s and early 70s, American audiences were shifting. Gritty urban dramas, psychological thrillers, and edgy counterculture stories were the new wave. Connors, with his towering frame and throwback masculinity, was seen as outdated. He wasn't a chameleon like Clint Eastwood or Steve McQueen. He was Chuck Connors, a towering cowboy with a moral compass, and that no longer fit the narrative Hollywood wanted. But there was something deeper, too. Connors had a reputation for being outspoken, especially about his politics. In an industry leaning increasingly liberal, his public support of figures like Nixon and Reagan rubbed many the wrong way. Some producers simply didn't want the baggage. Connors' strong conservative identity, once seen as patriotic, was now viewed as polarizing, and Hollywood was never kind to polarizing figures. Behind the scenes, Connors struggled with the rejection. He took guest roles on lower-budget TV shows and occasional parts in B-movies, but the days of top billing were over. The man who had once been a network's golden boy now found himself doing voiceovers and appearing in obscure Western revival specials. He stayed active. He wasn't the type to retire quietly, but it was clear the industry had moved on, even if he hadn't. Worse, the public seemed to forget. Younger generations didn't know his name. To them, the Rifleman was something their parents talked about, not something they watched. Connors, who once had fan mail by the truckload, was now largely invisible in the entertainment world. And for a man who'd once been larger than life, that obscurity stung. But Connors never complained publicly. He didn't launch bitter tirades about being blackballed. Instead, he focused on what mattered to him: occasional acting jobs, his family, and charitable work, especially with children's hospitals and veterans. He maintained his dignity, even as the spotlight dimmed. Chuck Connors' fall wasn't explosive or scandal-ridden. It was quiet, slow, and maybe even a little cruel, but it was also revealing. It showed what happens when someone refuses to conform, when fame fades, and when the industry that built you suddenly forgets your name. As the 1980s rolled in, Chuck Connors was no longer the leading man lighting up television screens, but he was far from forgotten. While Hollywood may have distanced itself from the aging Western star, fans never truly let go. In quiet corners of the country, reruns of The Rifleman played like comforting echoes of a different era, and Connors himself continued to receive heartfelt letters from those who still saw him as the moral compass of American television. Despite his reduced visibility on screen, Connors stayed active throughout his later years. He took on occasional acting role, appeared at fan conventions, and became a regular presence at charity events. His towering presence and unmistakable voice still turned heads, but now he carried a softer, more reflective energy. Fame had humbled him, and age had brought a kind of peace. But his health told a different story. Years of chain smoking, something he was rarely seen without, caught up with him. Connors developed lung cancer in the early 1990s, and by the time it was diagnosed, it had already spread. He kept the details mostly private, not one to dwell on illness or seek sympathy. For a man who spent his entire life projecting strength, vulnerability never came easy. On November 10th, 1992, Chuck Connors passed away at the age of 71. His death was quiet, but the tributes that followed were not. Fans, fellow actors, and even political figures spoke out about what he had meant to them. Ronald Reagan called him a man of integrity and character, while letters poured in from across the globe, from people who still remember the life lessons taught between gunshots on the Rifleman. But perhaps the most surprising legacy of all was how global it was. In Russia, where Brezhnev had once been his unlikely superfan, Connors was still remembered decades later. In parts of rural America, he remained a hero, and to Western fans around the world, he symbolized something that seemed lost: A time when values were simple, heroes were flawed but noble, and every episode ended with a hard-earned lesson. Chuck Connors wasn't just a cowboy or a ball player or a political oddity. He was a rule breaker. He shattered stereotypes, crossed boundaries, and lived on his own terms, regardless of how uncomfortable that made others. He could have stayed in the world of sports. He could have played it safe in Hollywood. But instead, he took risks, embraced contradictions, and carved out a space that no one else could fill. And that's why, decades after his death, he's still talked about. Not because he was perfect, but because he wasn't. Because he was human. Strong, stubborn, compassionate, complex. The man who once shook hands with the leader of the Soviet Union in one breath and campaigned for Nixon in the next didn't ask for approval. He just kept going. In the end, Chuck Connors didn't need the industry's validation. He had something better, a legacy built not just on fame, but on fearless authenticity. And that's a story no one can take away. And that's the real story behind Chuck Connors, the rule breaker Hollywood couldn't control. His life wasn't perfect, but it was fearless. If you found this story as fascinating as we did, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more untold stories and deep dives into legends they tried to forget. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.